All right, good evening, everyone. All right, thank you, everyone, for coming. Again, good evening. My name is John Reiner. I'm the Director of Planning and Development Services for the town of Groton. Here with me tonight, Jeff Davis from Horsley Witten and Jeremy Lake from Union Studios. We're going to talk about our Poquonnock Bridge design guidelines in the district. I also want to thank a number of members of our Planning Commission that are here tonight, our Zoning Commission. I see some RTM members, some council members. So thank you for all of you for coming here tonight. The reason that we're doing this project, just to kind of give a very brief introduction, our long-range plan that we look at for the town, our plan of conservation and development, really focused on looking at some of our historic districts within the town, our historic developed areas, specifically Poquonnock Bridge, and it recommended the town take a deep dive into that, looking at how can we preserve some of the historic development patterns there while allowing new development and keeping it as pedestrian friendly as possible. We do have some seats up front here for those that are coming in. There's a bunch of seats here, a couple mingled in, you know. Be brave, sit up front.
We don't charge any more for the front row.
That's right, that's right. And what we're doing is not meant to take any future development away from our downtown. This is a small commercial district today as it exists that's really serving that surrounding neighborhood, a little bit of passerby traffic, and we really just want to embrace that and help that development continue on in the future. Again, this is already a mixed-use area, and one of the things that Jeremy will talk about a little bit in his presentation, and Jeff also, today in the area, the study area that we're looking at, there are 8 different zoning districts and 1 overlay zone. So there's really a kind of a mishmash of zoning, and as we move forward on our larger rezoning effort that we've been working on for the past couple of years, we're trying to just create some consistency for development moving forward. And I don't want to take too much away from Jeremy's presentation and what Jeff is going to say. So again, thank you very much for coming tonight. And with that, I'll hand it over to Jeremy.
Great, thank you, John.
And at the end, we will have time for questions at the end. When we do, we'll just hand around the microphone because we are recording this so people can watch this in the future. And lastly, if you haven't, when you came in, signed in, please just sign in before you leave. Thank you.
So thank you all for coming out. Again, my name is Jeremy Lake. I'm part of Union Studio Architecture and Community Design. I also wanted to recognize, in addition to John, Deb Jones and Diane Glembowski. They've been very involved on the town side. And again, Jeff Davis is here as well with Horsley Witten. We've been working closely with Horsley Witten. Horsley Witten's been working on the rezoning effort. These are the design guidelines that tie closely to those, and so we've been going sort of back and forth between those two efforts. I'm going to go partway through this presentation, and I'm going to actually pass it over to Jeff to present for a few minutes on where the zoning stands before I then shift back. So we're going to take a few turns in here, which will be nice to break up the speakers here as well. If you guys don't mind, I'm going to hit the switch so you guys can see the screen. You might not see me. That's okay. Now nobody can see anybody. All right. So again, this is who we are. In terms of our agenda tonight, obviously we just introduced ourselves. We're going to talk a little bit of our process and schedule. I'm going to do a brief recap of our first presentation. We were here almost a year ago, which is crazy to think it's been that long. And I just want to quickly go through those things for those of you that weren't here, just to give you some context and understanding. We've concluded that session with a visual preference survey, and I'm going to share the results of that survey, our takeaways from that. I'm then going to pass it to Jeff for the zoning regulations update before I talk a little bit about the design guidelines, the draft of those, where those stands at the moment. We're going to then show some illustrative examples, which I think will be the most meaningful point, where we're trying to show you how these things actually translate to things on the actual ground here, actually in Poquonnock Bridge Village, which is helpful. And then again, at the end, we want to leave time for some discussion. So that's what we're going to try to get through tonight. Process and schedule. We kicked this off in November of 2017. We took about 6 months then to go through, understand the existing conditions, look at a lot of the previous studies that had been done, start to identify what the design district boundary might be. And we concluded that first portion with a first public presentation, again, almost a year ago on April 30th. Hopefully some of you were here then. Again, if not, we're going to go through some of what we talked about there. We did take a hiatus. We took about a 6-month break to let the zoning efforts go forward. Horsley Witten's real piece, working with John and the town folks here. And now we revamped ourselves back up in November, really doing some more analysis of these existing conditions, which we were actually doing all the way through. Some conceptual diagrams, coming up with the draft design guidelines, we're here today talking about this draft of where they are. And basically coming out of today, our goal is to take the next few weeks to then sort of finalize those based on the input we get tonight, based on the input we're getting from the town, who's also in the midst of reviewing it. So that's where we stand. That's what our process is. Quick recap of the first public presentation. Everyone here probably knows what we mean by a Poquonnock Bridge. It's this area that's sort of in the middle of the town. Zooming in a little bit more closely, the area that was the real interest, the real desire for the focus was Fort Hill Road, Route 1 coming through the middle of town here, where Newtown Road comes and intersects. We're here in the library right here. There's a number of mixed uses going on through here, a number of institutional uses, which we'll point out in a bit. There's also some single-family neighborhoods that obviously fit into this zone, but those are not part of what we're talking about tonight. Those are technically just outside of the boundary, but it's important to understand how they relate to the uses and things going on within the district itself. Again, here's a little aerial image, so really, you know, everything from the actual Poquonnock Bridge and the Baptist Church all the way over to Claude Chester School turning up. And we'll show you, we get more defined as we go through, but this is the general area we're speaking to. And the point that John made earlier, a lot of what started this off, the reason to do this is at the moment when you look in this area, there's a desire to have this be a cohesive village center, right? And it's really hard to make a cohesive village center when you've really chopped it up into all these various types of zoning, each with their own regulations. How does this all come together in a meaningful way? That's the real challenge that we're trying to solve. A little bit on the project background. These were some of the many studies that we looked at and studied as part of our process. The one that was most sort of informative for us was the Groton Plan of Conservation and Development from only a few years ago. That's really what sort of was the catalyst for what we're here to talk about tonight. And just to point out a few things that came out of that, Poquonnock Bridge was identified as a historic village center. This was a proposed historic district that's right here. This is Fitch, Town Hall, a number of the parcels that are along here, North Road, South Road. This really is the historic center of Poquonnock Bridge Village. And this report identified the Poquonnock Bridge Village District as a special focus area. And so the diagram from the book is here. Again, this is Route 1 coming through. This is Newtown Road. This is South Road. Everything in green was the stuff that was suggested as being something that might want to be considered as part of this special focus area. The desire here was to permit and control development within the designated area, to protect and enhance historic village development patterns while building on the recommendations of the Historic Preservation Survey. So again, the proposed development type, this is key here tonight, village development pattern with historical architectural styles and massing, mixed uses, pedestrian friendly. So those are the themes that are going to keep recurring through everything that we're talking about here tonight. And again, what I just read out loud, district should develop in a village pattern with historical styles, massing, mixed use, pedestrian friendly. What do we mean by that? Last time we showed an example of Mystic. It was sort of a tale of two mystics. Not that Poquonnock Bridge should be Mystic, but that when you look at Mystic, you get this idea very clearly. When you're in Mystic and you're right at right where the bridge crosses over, you know you're in the most historic portion of town. The buildings are small in scale, they're historic, they're right up on the street, they make it very walkable. There is parking, but it's tucked back behind the building facades. Everything's neat, compact, friendly place to walk. Then when in Mystic you get out towards the highway, everything flips on its head, right? Here's the road, the buildings are set way back, all of the parking is in front. You know, you've got gas stations, hotels, strip malls, and the result of those, even if the uses are similar, the result of those two very different development patterns is two very different experiences when you're on the ground. And so the point is, how do we reinforce a walkable pattern, maybe not quite as dense as this for Poquonnock Bridge, because Poquonnock Bridge is much more rural in character. But the idea is making a walkable environment versus an environment that is not particularly friendly at all to walking. I made the point here, this little boy walking on his own, I have no idea who he's supposed to be with, but you're not as worried about him in that environment. If you saw that same kid walking through here, we'd probably pull over, hey buddy, are you okay? Do you know where you are? Sort of thing. So it's very telling, right? So what about Poquonnock Bridge Village, though? So again, when we look closely, we see there's a tale of two Poquonnock Bridge villages, too. So there are places where the historic pattern is still intact, and you can imagine this being a very walkable, friendly, businesses right on the road sort of environment, and that's the sort of pattern that we want to try to reinforce here. And then you turn around and you can see things that have happened in the last 50 years where that pattern wasn't necessarily respected. Not that there's an issue, it's great that the true value is here, it's important that the hardware store is here, but this pattern of setting way back from the street, having all of the parking in front, yes, there is a sidewalk here, but this isn't necessarily a particularly friendly place to walk when compared to some of the other areas in Poquonnock Village that we want to reinforce and support. And lastly, design guidelines are a great tool for promoting appropriate development. That's what came out of this report, and that was the impetus for us then being here trying to develop those design guidelines. One of the last things we talked about at the last meeting is, so what is the area that we're talking about? Again, I hinted at this earlier. The idea was to capture, the colors are the various uses in this district, which are highlighted up here. So the red are commercial uses, the blue are institutional uses, so this is the library, the senior center, Claude Chester School, the old Fitch Middle School, Town Hall. The hatched areas are some multifamily areas, and so the yellow, the solid yellow, are the single family areas. And you can see the idea was to capture the things that fit in between those single family areas. And this was the draft area that we were talking about at the last presentation. This has evolved a little bit. I'm going to let Jeff talk about that when he shows you where it stands in the zoning. So the visual preference survey. So we concluded the last session with this visual preference survey. And what we did is we had a series of boards that were up at the back of the room. We did a presentation to start, and then we concluded with having everybody go to the back of the room. And we would show two images that were related but different in certain ways. And we asked people basically to just put a sticker on which image they preferred. And it was very telling for us to then go back and look for some of the patterns we found through those results to see if they reinforce some of those goals that were set out in the community development plan. And so these were the boards and these were the results that we got. So again, two very different images at the top. In this case, you can see an overwhelming majority of folks, 35 of the 38 votes, picked image number 1. What does that mean? I'll talk about that in a little bit, but I'll go through the boards first. The second pairing of images, different in terms of scale, but very similar in terms of the sort of quality of the public realm, the variety of building forms, in this case lower scale, this case higher scale, a very split vote in this case. And this image we showed, Mystic, compared to, this is Patriot Place in Foxborough. Most folks picked this image over this image, and when we talk through the reasons why, I think we'll see what the reasons are behind that. We'll share that in a minute. Between these two images, again, very split. You actually had 10 people put their dot literally on the line. Either one of these would work for me. So subtle variation here between the two, right? So the way these match the sidewalk, very comparable. For us, it was sort of a matter of this being a little bit more of a formal building, this one feeling a little more informal. I think that's why, twice as many people picked this one than this one. But again, a pretty close vote overall. Another one of our overwhelming ones had to show 2 Starbucks, so you weren't voting that, oh, I love Starbucks, but whatever that other thing I don't care about. This one's very telling, right? This one was very much about style, something that's much more contemporary, something much more traditional. We heard people loud and clear, at least the folks that were here last time. Between these two images, it was really, again, both very historic sort of buildings. This one a little bit bigger in terms of scale, a little bit closer to the street. This one a little more informal, a little more rural. Again, twice as many people picking this image over the other image, which we think makes sense here. And I think I have only 2 more images. So in this case, again, we showed, 2 storefronts. Again, more people picking this one. In this case, this maybe is a little too informal, maybe a little too rustic. But again, we were trying to understand where we might sit in that range. This one, very telling. Again, this is downtown Mystic. This is somewhere, I think, on the Cape. But this feels very villagey, very sort of informal. And that spoke, obviously, to a lot of people, 32-4 on the votes on this one. And then lastly, the 2 flower shops, again, one that's much more historic and rural in feel, one more contemporary and urban, again, 27 votes versus 9. So there was pretty clear. Again, in all of these, there were 9 people that did vote for this, right? So it's not like it's totally clear cut, but we were looking for the trends and patterns in here. And then lastly, this was something I threw in just as a New England transplant. I'm still trying to understand where that line is. I'm getting a sense now. It's like Hartford is the line, right? So we're a little bit east of Hartford. So I love the dot down here. Like, keep me out of this one, right? All right. So again, the point here was to try to understand how does this relate to this desire to have the district develop in a village pattern, historical styles of massing, mixed use, pedestrian friendly. And so these were the trends that we saw when comparing these images. First, the notion of a village pattern versus sprawl. Right? The image that showed very much this, what we would expect to find in a historic village. Buildings a little bit closer to the street, historical language, 2-3 stories in scale, versus the 1-story strip mall set back behind the parking, clear cut, right? This was one of the images that was a little less clear. There was generally consensus for the more historic versus the more sort of sprawling, although I think part of the reason this did so well is when you look in front of this, we didn't show the picture with all the parking in front of it. What you see is the pedestrian area in front of it. So what's really nice is this picture looks like a wonderful place to go for a walk, whereas this is looking a little bit traffic heavy, a little bit congested. So we think that was maybe what we were picking up on there. Main Street versus rural village. This is really sort of thinking about Mystic is sort of that tight Main Street kind of condition versus something that's a little looser, a little more informal, a little more rural. And we think that for Poquonnock Bridge, that more rural feel is really what we're going after. And that's what we saw reinforced here as well. So this board, twice as many votes for the one that was a little more informal. Certainly this one that was much more village than Main Street, overwhelming support there. This one a little more informal, then a little bit more structured Main Street support there. This one, again, on the one that's a little more informal. So again, that's what we were not wanting, but expecting, and that's what the report was calling for, and these boards seem to be reinforcing that notion. In terms of the style of the architecture, again, the community development plan said it should be sort of historical styles, but we wanted to test that out. So when we showed traditional versus more contemporary, traditional won out. This one a little less clear cut, although again, I think it has more to do with what you're seeing in front of the buildings than the buildings themselves. This one's clear cut, this one's pretty clear cut. So again, there did seem to be a support for the more traditional vibe that's already in Poquonnock Bridge Village, right? We're reinforcing a pattern that already exists. And then in terms of the scale and character of the architecture, when you think about like the number of floors here, what was interesting is when we showed something that was distinctly commercial, one story, a lot of support for the multi-story. In this case, it was a pretty split vote, which seems to suggest anywhere between 1.5 to 2.5 to 3 stories is appropriate. We think that's valid. That's what you find out in the village currently as well. And again, the image that is a little bit misleading. It's hard to decipher, but again, people seemingly preferring when you have this mix of uses, there's interest, there's people upstairs and downstairs, people can actually live there versus the purely commercial district that goes dark at night. And the last comparison here, the impact of automobiles. So we also saw anytime there was an image where there were pictures of cars versus not, people also trended that way. That, again, I think is the bias that we see in this one. I think if this one had a bunch of parking in front of it, we would have gotten a different reaction. Certainly on this one, too, it's probably both the informal character, but also the fact that it doesn't look like a lot of cars are coming and going. We get it. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Jeff for a few slides to bring you up to speed on where we stand. So that was the last presentation. So now this is everything that we've been working on in the meantime. So.
Hello, everyone. All right. Thank you so much again. Whoops, wrong way. Get to know how to do this. Thank you so much again for coming out on this beautiful evening. So my job tonight is to talk to you about the zoning standards that we are proposing for this area. And you should know that with staff, with the Zoning Commission, hearing from you all last year, there's been a lot of discussion about what ought to be a standard in the zoning, which is something that you must do, versus a guideline outside of zoning, which are the things that you're encouraged to do. We've gone back and forth for many, many months on this issue, and where we've landed today is that there is probably more of a desire, more impact will be had by having more guidelines than standards. So right now, in this draft, the standards, things you must do, are much more limited than the guidelines. So as a consequence, I'm going to try to keep my commentary relatively brief so that we can get down to the guidelines. So this is just to reiterate the point that Jeremy already made, that John made, that currently you've got sort of a hodgepodge of zoning districts. You cross the street and you can do different things. You can have different uses. You have different setback standards. And we were trying to just make that consistent throughout the whole village. So here you'll see in orange what's labeled MVC. So that is our acronym for Mixed Village Center. And so that is the area that we're hoping that this consolidated zoning district will cover.
And Jeff, can I speak just
yeah,
quickly
of course.
Back to that? So in terms of the area that now encompasses,
good point, yes.
So what we were showing before was roughly what you see in this orange area. What's been added is this little extension of North Road here, South Road has been extended further down, across down towards the airport, and I think it captured one or two sort of industrial sites that were in there as well. But it still, as you can see, stays outside of the single-family neighborhoods that are around it. So the area has kind of, it started big, it contracted, and then it came back out again. So this almost matches exactly with the green special focus area that was called for in the original community development plan
so
as
this
well.
very much mirrors what's in the plan of conservation and development for the town. So, what does the MVC, Mixed Use Village Center District, control? And I will say that for a lot of these things, we're really just reinforcing what's going to apply across the town. So what I'm going to focus on today are the additional things that only apply within the MVC. So first, dimensional standards. Because we are covering a broad array of different types of properties within this area, we have built in so that we know that not everything is going to work perfectly for every property within this area. We've built in some flexibility. So generally in zoning, you'll have maximum and minimum setbacks, and we've tried to create those so that you have buildings that are fronting the street, but not so close that you can't have a good sidewalk, not so close that you are having issues with traffic, because Route 1 is still going to be Route 1, and we've got to respect that and make sure that people are safe along Route 1. So one of the things we've been able to do is have different standards depending on where your property is located within the district. So we have deeper setbacks if you're on Route 1. We have deeper setbacks if you're abutting one of the residential districts, and we have shallower setbacks if you're somewhere in the middle of the zoning district. Also, making sure that the dimensional standards are more in line with what's already on the ground today. Again, because there were so many different zoning districts, it was difficult to make sure that matched what was actually on the ground. So you're looking at a smaller minimum lot area of only 5,000 square feet, which is actually pretty much in line with the historical buildings within the area. We're also allowing buildings to be attached at their sides if there is a common lot line agreement among the property owners. Height generally stays at the same, 35 feet. Coverage is a little greater, perhaps, than in the residential zones, because you have such small lots and you want to be able to do things with these lots. We have no minimum lot area per dwelling. So basically, because there's such a variety of sizes and types of lots in this area, we're saying, all right, if you have enough land for parking, if you can meet the height requirements, then it doesn't matter how many units are in a building, because it's really those other things that are going to put a cap on that naturally. Another thing that we looked at is public space. And we looked at having for parcels of 2 acres or greater, sites of 2 acres or greater only, so this would not apply to smaller properties, that we'd require 10% set aside for publicly accessible space. And here we just have a photo of a pocket park in a village. I can't remember which town in Connecticut this is. It is another Connecticut town that has a similar standard. So applicability, what would this apply to, these new standards? Of course, this only applies if you're doing something new. If you have a building in the area and you're not planning on doing any redevelopment with it, you're just going to do your standard repairs, none of this applies. So basically, this only applies if you have to go present a site plan to the new Planning and Zoning Commission. And you should note that single-family homes, and I believe two-family homes as well, are generally not subject to site plan. So any of the single-family homes that are within this district, this just does not apply to. And again, as I said, if you're not making any changes to your property, this won't apply to you either. So we're really looking at, as properties are ready to be redeveloped over time, then these standards apply. So I'm going to go through these very, very quickly. So again, these are the additional musts beyond what would be required elsewhere in town. We just really want to make sure that pedestrian and bikeways are clearly marked. So we have standards for making sure that that material of the sidewalks are different and really visible. So it makes it safer to cross the street, safer for drivers to know where pedestrians and bicyclists are going to be. For your frontage area, really try and discourage those frontage areas to be for cars and make sure that they're for pedestrians and bicyclists. Making sure that there are bikeways, making sure that there are good sidewalks, making sure that driveways are limited to what you need to access the site. Do also have a requirement of having at least a 10-foot wide sidewalk for properties that abut Route 1. Again, parking and loading, encouraging that to be to the side or to the rear. Now, where there's an existing parking lot, we're not going to make people rip it out or anything like that. If it's there, we just ask that you put up some landscaping or a small wall, partly for screening and for decoration, partly for safety. Fencing and screening. One small thing, chain link fencing is prohibited in the front and side yards unless it's needed for security purposes and screened with evergreens. Lighting and utilities. Simple, no more than 20 feet in height. Again, we want to reinforce that village scale, that human scale. We don't want really tall industrial scale lighting in the area, and really want to put as many utilities underground as possible. Building entranceways. Simple, very self-explanatory design standard. Make sure that your building entrances are really obvious. They're architecturally obvious, that they front on the street or they front on a sidewalk that's at least 10 feet wide. So you don't want your main entryway to be located to the rear where no one from the street can see it or look exactly the same as the service entrance right next to it so people don't know which door to go into. Building form. If you're going to go up to the fully allowable height, you could get up to a 3-story building. Just ask that you make it really obvious where the ground floor is, where the middle floor is, where the top floor is. Ask that you have at least an 11-foot ceiling on the ground floor. That makes it more flexible for a variety of uses. Again, we have a bunch of different types of uses that could occur here. Maybe residential, maybe commercial, but we want to have the flexibility that you could have some commercial use on the first floor. We also just ask that your front of the building looks like the front of the building. Again, there should be no confusion about where you need to go to get into a building. And finally, we don't want long, blank expanses of wall. So if there's ever a wall that is at least 40 feet long, that has to have some architectural differentiation. We want to avoid those long blank walls that are particularly facing the street. So again, we'll take questions at the end. I didn't want to spend a whole lot of time on these since, again, we really decided, based on your feedback and working with the Zoning Commission, that the guidelines is where the meat of this really is.
So to reiterate, zoning sets the standards that must be met. And what I'm here to talk about are the design guidelines, which really illustrate the principles that should be met, okay? So they are very much related. In fact, if you were to go through the elements that Jeff just talked about and the table of contents of the ones I'm about to show for you, you could do one of those little fun things where you draw a line from circulation to circulation, landscaping to landscaping, parking to parking. All those elements are basically repeated here again, but we go a little bit further. One thing, zoning tends to be a language-based thing, right? There's a bullet in a document that has about 2 paragraphs worth of text. The design guidelines are meant to be very visual and very illustrative, and that's what we'll be talking about here next. So in the design guidelines, this is the typical format that we use. So whatever topic we're talking about, it being lighting or be it sidewalks, whatever the case might be, we always try to give a little bit of an understanding of what the importance of that element is. Why is it that we're even talking about it in terms of design guidelines and zoning? We often try to do a whole section around the things that you should do. So these are appropriate examples and some key features of that. And we also often try to show something that you should avoid. So what's the problematic situation that we're trying to avoid when we're trying to reinforce the walkable historic character of Poquonnock Bridge Village? So I'm not going to go through every one of these, every word of these, but these are the various guidelines as they stand today. The first category is a number of things around the site design. So the bigger picture, first thing you're looking at when you're placing a building on a site. The first thing is the building location. And what these guidelines suggest is that when you're putting down a new building, the preference is for the building to relate to the street in front, because that's where the pedestrians are going to be, and have the parking be more sort of secondary, to the side, maybe even to the back. So again, what's the avoid? The avoid is pushing the building so far back that it no longer has a relationship to a street. It no longer has a relationship to the pedestrian on the sidewalk. And instead what you have is a lot of parking in front, because that's just not a very friendly environment to work in. In fact, if you're trying to attract the people coming and going down the street, they're less likely to walk into your store if they can't even see what's inside of there. So that's what we mean by building location. Building entry, Jeff made the point, if this is the street in front, the idea is that your primary entry should be either right on the front or maybe on an important corner. You can have a secondary entrance in the back, but that cannot be your primary entrance. Again, the idea here is make it an interesting environment for people walking by, make it easier for them to get in, reinforce this pattern of the importance of the sidewalk as a walkable, pedestrian-friendly sort of zone. In terms of parking location, again, this gets much more specific about the idea of it being in the back or to the side, instead of being somewhere in the front with the building set way back. A little bit nicer diagram of that. So in this case, here is the main street. So the idea is the parking still be readily understood and available. You come to the back to get it. Or in cases where it is on a secondary street or maybe up against a residential area, you should have some screening and hedges, potentially some fencing in there. Again, we talk about those more specifically, but that's the gist of the idea with parking location. Bike parking is great to include. We're sort of, again, encouraging it. We're not requiring it, but it's something to think about. I think especially in this zone, you realize how many schools are in this area, how many kids are coming and going. You know, I think that's something we didn't say early on, but I think it's important to think about that kind of pedestrian activity. Some of those kids might be on bikes as well. Wouldn't it be great if they could pull over, park their bike, run inside, grab a drink? Something to think about. Sidewalks is a big one. It's a challenge right now in the Poquonnock Bridge Village, is there's really an inconsistency with the way the sidewalks are, if they are there at all, or if they are there, where they're located. It's something that there needs to be some more cohesiveness around them. And really, when you're doing a sidewalk correctly, we think of it as being these sort of three zones, where there's what we call the furnishing zone. In this case, this is only showing grass because it's in a residential condition. But this is where we might expect to find street trees, fire hydrants, mailboxes, all the furnishings that we might find out on the street. Then there's the zone that you actually move through, the circulation zone, that wants to be very much clear. And there's what we call this frontage zone, which is all the stuff that's in that transitional area behind the sidewalk. So again, in a residential condition, that might be a front porch, that might be some landscaping. Here in a more sort of mixed-use environment, again, you can see that furnishing zone with the trash cans and the benches versus the pedestrian circulation zone versus this frontage zone might be where you allow people to have little planters. Maybe they have cafe seating. This is where you pull out the rack of clothes that are on sale. You're trying to get people interested to come into the store. The best designed sidewalks really respect those three zones because the sidewalk, that zone, has a lot of roles that it needs to include. Circulation, the idea here is, again, if you have crosswalks, they should be very visible, clearly marked. Again, that's helpful both for pedestrians to know where they should be crossing, and likewise for motorists to know where to look out for pedestrians potentially crossing. So sometimes this needs to be more than a really faded, painted white line, especially in places where there's either a lot of traffic volume, a lot of pedestrian volume. So there's varying ways of handling that, but it's something that should certainly be considered. The next category is building design. So the first one is really just when proposing new construction. You know, when you look at Poquonnock Village, the historic buildings that are out there, they tend to actually be relatively simple in terms of their massing. They're often a single volume with a single gabled roof, maybe a couple of those attached, but it's not the classic suburban model where you take 6 buildings and smush them together. It's like the whole village came together in one facade. We're trying to avoid that because that's not what you would have traditionally found. So that's not really reinforcing the pattern that's already in Poquonnock Bridge. So this is really sort of the, you know, this isn't from specifically Poquonnock Bridge, but you find this same pattern in Poquonnock Bridge. When you are doing additions in terms of building, this is another point about building form. It's important to sort of make sure that the original building massing is clearly the primary massing and that the additions are these secondary things that respect the original massing, but you could still look at it and logically see the original building that was there. I'll show you some examples of that in a little bit. Historic infill, so when you're considering new buildings in this district, one thing to consider is that even if it is a larger scale building, it should do a number of tricks to try to break down its scale so that it relates to the historic character. So we show a couple examples here of buildings where by popping out a gable or maybe having dormers to hide an upper floor, maybe pulling forward the commercial portion but recessing the upper floors. The idea is to make sure that something new still fits in with some of the older things that are already in place. We also some suggested regulations around how to do a storefront. So when it is a store or a restaurant or whatever it might be that's inside of that building, there's an appropriate way to do that so that people going by are aware of what's going on. It makes your walk a lot more interesting if you know what's going on behind the facade. What you want to avoid is when you have a facade that only has like one or two little windows, and so you really would have to get up there and peek in to see what's going on. It's a subtle thing, but it's an important detail in making these places great. The last category are site components. So these are just the little elements that then make up a lot of the public realm. So again, lighting. Jeff talked about the very specific, the light can be no more than 20 feet tall. That's what goes into the zoning. And to the design guidelines, we talk a little bit more about, in addition to the height, the character of it should be more pedestrian in scale. What we want to avoid, we call these cobra heads, this like classic parking lot highway light that has zero character, shoots a bunch of crap light all over the place. It's not what you're going for if you're trying to create a really nice pedestrian environment. Likewise, landscaping. Plants should be native plants so that they don't require lots of watering. They should be applied in ways that really create nice public areas, or in this case here, using the trees as a means of delineating between the pedestrian portion of the sidewalk and the vehicular portion of the street. So some suggestions around how to think about landscaping. Street trees, again, I just mentioned those, but the idea of trying to, wherever possible, include street trees in a strip between the street and the sidewalk. These are amazing in terms of helping you feel safer as you're walking down the sidewalk. They've truly separated you from the cars. The shade is obviously welcome certain times of year. So street trees, which there are places in Poquonnock Village where you get some street trees pretty regularly. There's a lot of places where we don't, and that's one thing that we think would be a good thing to try to bring back and reinforce in this district. And then last but not least, fences and walls. And as Jeff mentioned, we're trying to avoid the chain link fence look, the institutional kind of fencing. And again, this is for the mixed use district, right? We're not talking about the single family areas. So if you have a parking lot or a deep setback, the idea is to have this sort of lower scale, historically appropriate sort of fencing that can do a great job of delineating, but without sort of creating privacy or making you feel like you're lost. So those are the guidelines. Again, those are general principles around some items here. Obviously, this isn't an exhausted list. This is the stuff that we think is the most important stuff for helping reinforce the historic walkable pattern here in Poquonnock Bridge. But we did want to do some illustrative examples so you can see how this might play out in a couple of places around town. So the first area that we looked at was, this is Fort Hill Road, where Newtown Road comes in here. You got a couple of existing commercial properties here, the gas station on the corner, the office building on this corner, and you have the linear bike path on this side of the street. Here's the school where the kids come out and walk, and suddenly the sidewalk disappears on them. So this was sort of an important node in the larger area that we thought we could show a couple of the elements that we were trying to reinforce here today. And so we did this sketch, which we'll talk about in a little more detail, which really shows two things. One is an example of a commercial redevelopment. So we showed what we might do if we imagined one of those or both of those buildings was going to be torn down and replaced for some reason. And then we also wanted to show a number of principles around streetscape improvements along the edge of Fort Hill Road here. So we'll go through both of those. In terms of the commercial redevelopment, there are a few principles we wanted to show. First, new buildings fit village scale and character. So instead of being maybe a single large 3-story building in the middle of the lot, really breaking that down into a series of smaller buildings that have the scale and character in keeping with the existing stuff that you find here today. In a similar light, even with a gas station, instead of putting the building back with all the pumps up front, which isn't a particularly pleasant thing to walk by, there are examples of gas stations where the actual building comes out to the corner and the gas pumps are off to the side or maybe even in the back. What's great about that is a lot of time the new gas stations kind of are also your corner store, right? Think of like Cumberland Farms. You're going there to get a drink, you're going there to get a snack. And so if you can bring it out to the corner, it can really operate as that corner store instead of being the building that's back behind the gas pumps that you might not want to go through and go past. The buildings are at the street with parking to the side or back. So again, instead of the building being set back with the parking being in front or the gas pumps being in front, pulling the buildings forward and really making the parking the thing that sets back off of the street. Building entries face the street. So again, with the new buildings we're showing, the idea here is that they open directly out onto Fort Hill Road. Shared drives and parking areas, so to the extent possible, maybe this parking lot could connect through to this parking lot. We could get one more of the driveways coming out and through. And to a lesser degree, showing the idea of the screening for the parking areas. So the places where the parking is exposed, maybe there are some hedges or some low sort of fence there. Again, just so that as you're walking along, you have a nice experience. You don't find yourself feeling like you're in the midst of all the cars. Or maybe the Groton family farm gets converted to residential, and it would be nice if the residential wasn't looking right at the parking lot, but there was this zone of hedges to kind of help separate and screen those two uses. In terms of some of the potential street improvements, improve pedestrian crossings. So anywhere we have an intersection, like at Newtown and Fort Hill Road, right now you have this crosswalk that sort of goes on for days. Maybe there's an option where we could find some islands that land you a safe spot midway across. We showed the similar kind of approach here at this intersection. But this is just a concept, but the idea is that really reinforcing and trying to make the best crossings possible. So the road still needs to operate and function for vehicular use, but we need to do it in a way that really makes the drivers aware that this is a place that pedestrians will be crossing. Cohesive screening for residential backyards. One of the unique conditions we have in this section of town is all of the residential units back here are really backing to Fort Hill Road. And you get a variety of conditions along there. Sometimes there's trees and hedges that screen it. Other times it's wide open. And that's sort of unfortunate for both sides of the fence, right? If that's your backyard, you certainly don't have a lot of privacy. And from the Fort Hill Road side of things, there's nothing really holding up that edge of the street as you're moving along the bike path. So what we've suggested is maybe it would be great if there could be a continuous, cohesive fence that runs all the way along that edge. So every yard has a fence and something that delineates the public versus the private space. There could be cohesive plantings along that edge. And again, if we could get a row of street trees in that grass strip between the path and the street, it would make that path feel that much more safer and friendly to use. Parking located beside structures. So in this case, the existing commercial properties that are out there today, they have some parking actually in front of the buildings. And as a result, the curb and the sidewalk have been basically completely obliterated. So there really isn't any pedestrian zone in the public way, which is problematic. So one thought would be to actually, instead of having the parking here, they certainly have parking on the sides and in the back, consolidate to a single curb cut where you can still get to parking, convenient parking to get in, but really the zone in front of the building could be converted over to a combination of a sidewalk that can come through. Again, think of the students coming out from school and being able to walk along the side of the street. And then that also can become that sort of frontage zone. So maybe the cafe that's here suddenly has some seating out front, or maybe the store that's here has a little place to put out some of the items that are for sale. So again, the buildings are in the exact same location and the exact same configuration, but creating a much more pedestrian-friendly and I think business-friendly, actually, environment right in front of those structures. So that's building frontages converted to pedestrian uses. And a continuous sidewalk behind regularly spaced street trees. So I talked about that on this side, but you can see we're trying to reinforce that here as well. So instead of having to guess like, oh, is it okay to walk here? Maybe I need to cross, come here, do I cross back over again? Really thinking about how to make that a continuous, cohesive sequence of sidewalks is important. So what might that look like? Here's the condition you have today. So this is one of the places where you do have some thick landscaping screening the back of this. But again, you can see there's nothing really between the path and the cars other than a couple utility poles. Here's a part of that section where the sidewalk's been sort of blown away, the gas station setback, the office building setback. And so here's what this might look like if we were to implement some of the guidelines that we're talking about here. So on this side of Fort Hill Road, again, a more continuous privacy fencing that has a shared character all the way through. Maybe some landscaping in front of that fence to soften that edge. Continuous street trees. Where did the utilities go? They went underground. You might remember Jeff mentioned that as one of the standards that we want to set is actually having the utilities go below ground, because that opens up the possibility here for these street trees. So again, on this side, in this zone that's currently completely obliterated, now we can add a sidewalk coming through, trees coming through. Here's that new corner store out on the corner. Here's that next building down there. Again, what we're trying to reinforce are the best parts of Poquonnock Bridge in the places where it's falling short at the moment. So again, I talked about all these points. These are all the elements that this showed. Here's a little bit of that idea of screening the parking when it does make itself out to the street. So the other area we looked at is a little further down Fort Hill Road at where South Road comes in. Town Hall's right here. And we actually drew a couple of things here that we'll talk about individually through this district. So in this case, we have an example over here of some historic conversions, so a couple of the existing buildings that are out there and what we might do if we were to imagine converting those. There's a whole pocket in here where I'll show it in a minute, but we showed the idea of there being some infill development in some of the areas that are currently underutilized. And we also showed some additional streetscape improvements, including what we might do around the town hall, now that the middle school is being converted to a community center, really making this feel more like a meaningful place rather than the parking lots that are there today. So examples of the historic conversion. New additions are secondary to the existing structures. So we showed in a couple instances, here's the existing building that's out there today. If you were going to do an addition, maybe you do an addition off of the back of the building, so it doesn't take away from the historic character. Or in this case, maybe there's a way of doing an addition off of the side of the building to expand upon the area that's available inside. What we're not showing is putting a big addition off of the front of the building, where all of a sudden you lose the original building, you lose the original sense of that street. Building entries face the street. They do that naturally with the older buildings. We also showed a few new buildings coming into play, so that this entry is here as well. New buildings fit the village scale and character. So again, the buildings that we're plugging in here are very much trying to work at feeling like they might have been there all along. It's not something that's completely different and foreign to the patterns that we find currently. And shared drives and parking areas. It'd be really neat if instead of every one of these having to have their own driveway going to their own little parking lot, maybe you can consolidate and only have one or two drives with a larger shared parking area to the rear. Those folks could filter through. Maybe there's something cool to do between the buildings, like cafe seating on your way to the front doors here in the front. So again, these were just some ideas to try to illustrate some of the things that you might expect these guidelines to promote. And in fact, there are some examples out there today. I don't know for certain, but when I look at this building, I really feel like that was probably the original building that was out there, and at one point somebody built this addition off of the side. So I still very much read the original building, but this very much fits into the character of that. They picked up on a lot of the detailing. You know, this roof is subservient to the primary building. So again, I don't know for certain if it is, but it certainly feels like it could be or is a good example of what you should do. And I know the salon across where this is what used to be the old appliance store. You know, this is a great example of how when you have these storefronts, you can really see what's going on. It brings a lot of activity and if you're walking through this area, you know, that's light at night, there's people, there's eyes on the street, it's a sense of security and safety, and now you're aware that there's a salon in there too. So the importance of doing the storefronts in the appropriate way. An example of infill development, and so we showed that, you know, there's this area over here that has a lot of open ground, which isn't to say there's anything wrong with open ground, but if there was pressure to force some more development in the area, we tried to show the notion of potentially, you know, keeping the historic homes that are here in these locations and sort of working around them. And so new buildings fit village scale and character. So the new housing that's provided is, you know, this sort of single family increment, or maybe there's a new mixed use building out on the main drag. The design includes public open spaces. Jeff alluded to this idea of when you have a larger development, it'd be great if you can include some of these pocket parks. So in this case, we showed one that's a little more public right off of the Fort Hill Road area that you might walk into. Maybe this is a place you grab an ice cream and you come out and have it. You could also have some spaces that are really more internal, really for the residents that live there as a gathering point. But again, the incorporation of public open spaces. Again, the mixed-use component at the street with the residential behind. Again, it'd be great if the real activity is brought to the street out Fort Hill Road. And consolidated parking areas and driveways. So one thing we showed was the idea of maybe there's a new little street that cuts through, but maybe some of these uses can consolidate their parking in the back instead of every single unit having a driveway. So again, just some of the concepts that we wanted to try to illustrate. And in fact, this is the Groton family farm. This is a study that was done by others at one point. So again, this reinforces a lot of those same ideas. So the commercial or the mixed use is more to the front, residential in the back, potential for some open space, looking at a couple of different configurations. So again, the Groton family farm is sort of an obvious place that someone might want to redevelop because it is all this land right on Route 1. And so the hope would be that by having these kinds of guidelines in place now, you get the kind of development that feels like it belongs here versus having, you know, this isn't big enough for Walmart, but some other big suburban kind of group coming along and proposing something that wouldn't fit into the character of the community. And lastly, the example of the streetscape improvements. So in this case, we tried to show what we might be doing along Fort Hill Road and around Town Hall. So currently, this is just a whole lot of parking. It's just a parking lot back behind here, but there's no reason you couldn't convert that to feel more like a two-way street, maybe with some parallel parking, sidewalks, street trees, reinforcing the connections there so that people really feel like this is a place you come back to. It's not just a place you drive into. Continuous sidewalks behind regularly spaced street trees. So again, like this is one place in town where you do have, the sidewalk setback behind a nice tree strip. There's some trees in this zone, but let's continue that all the way through in other areas as well where we can. Building frontage converted to pedestrian uses. There was another example here where there's a building that's pretty close to the street and there's nothing in front of there. So theoretically, you could just kind of pull your car right off, which also means you're pulling your car right back out into traffic. It would be a lot nicer if that actually had a little bit of a frontage zone. Again, the uses, the cafe that's there could actually put some tables out. People could walk through here a little more conveniently. Screening for parking areas. So in this case, one of the things we were trying to show, I know it's very minor, but even here where we've got the parking lot in front of the Ace Hardware, what would be really great is if we could get a low hedge and a low fence along here and a sidewalk. Suddenly walking through here would be a much more reasonable endeavor. And improve pedestrian crossings. So again, reinforcing this idea of let's think creatively about how we make sure that the crossings at each one of these important points is clear and safe. So lastly, we just wanted to show, again, those principles on the ground. This is the old Firehouse, which is just up the road from where we were just drawing. And so we tried to show how this might look, again, if this was to be converted and follow some of these principles. So again, continuous sidewalk behind regular spaced street trees. So to go back up. Currently, right, it was the apron for the fire trucks, but even look on this side of the street, right? These houses come out and they have a sidewalk to nothing, right, currently. So let's introduce some sidewalks on both sides of the street so you have places to come out to. In this case, there's not really enough room to do a row of street trees, so maybe you set the street trees on the back side, or where you can, you jog the sidewalk so you can get the street trees back. Building frontages converted to pedestrian uses. So again, in front here, instead of thinking of this as a place to put 4 parking spots, let's make that some seating for a potential cafe inside of the Firehouse. Screening for the parking areas. Over here, we do have parking. Let's have some hedges to help delineate those 2 spaces. Utilities relocated underground. Again, if I showed you the before, there's all the poles running up through here. Building entries facing the street. So the new use that came in here, the entry is out this way. It's not back over here where the parking is, which is what the inclination is by people that aren't thinking about how it fits into the bigger picture. They're thinking, my customer parks here, my customer walks right in the door. This is really much more about a bigger picture, civic-related approach. And again, storefronts allow visibility into active uses. So imagine if you could convert those doors into some open windows that show what's going on inside. Now when you're walking by, you immediately know what's going on inside. You've got all those people looking back out at you, so you feel safe as you walk through here. So again, this is just another example of applying these various principles to the existing conditions you find out there today. So that's what we've got. As a quick reminder for those of you that don't know, there is a website for the ongoing zoning regulations update, grotonctzoning.com. So again, even coming out of tonight, if you want to keep understanding what's going on and where things are moving, this is a great site to do so. But again, what we really wanted to do was now open it up to you guys for questions, thoughts, discussion. John's with me, Jeff's up here with me as well, so happy to take your questions.
And just for purposes, so we'll put the lights back on. For purposes of recording, if you have a question or comment, it would be great if we could pass the mic around if you want to say something, and we can go from there. So any comments?
John?
Oh,
I'll be happy to comment.
of course.
In one session, you're showing part of Claude Chester being developed, the backside of the parking lot, and in the next breath, you're telling me all the schools that are there. Well, they've closed all the schools that are there, and they plan on closing Claude Chester. So let's not be realistic saying all the little kiddies got to walk. The kiddies from Poquonnock Bridge that want to go to the store certainly should have a safe walk to get to the store. And who's going to pay for all the shrubs? The state of Connecticut going to pay for that? Who's going to put all the fence up along the project? Are we paying for that? And who's going to pay to put all the wires underground? I know it would cost the fire district quite a bit of money because we still have the boxes up, et cetera, on the poles. And is the 35-foot height limit, is that okay with the airport? They're good with 35 foot? I just want to know who's going to pay for it all, and what is it going to gain. I can tell you that and I'm sure it's not the reason that he closed, but when they took in front of Paul's TV and put that silly curb in front of there, down in the city, he told me that made an impact on him losing business, because you couldn't get in there to park, and when you can't get in and out to park easy. People don't want it. It's the same reason that that piece on the corner by Hillary on Route 1 is still vacant, because it's awful to get out, and nothing's ever made it there. So you got to be careful how you do the parking. And if I'm coming in and I'm the first guy in thinking I got to put all this money in, put the sidewalk in and that, what's going to want me to do that? I want to open my little store and I don't want to go through all of that crap. So there's a lot more to look at than what you presented. It all sounds good. Do you think they're going to turn the gas station around? Not for 20 years maybe. The guy just bought all them gas stations. So the big picture, as far as I'm concerned, can I take my house on South Road and make that into a business now? That's what I would like to know.
So a lot of questions there. First of all, if these are adopted, accepted in this form, you don't have to do anything. Who's going to pay for this? Development over time. People think when, the larger zoning project that we're working on right now, it's okay, we're going to adopt new zoning and then everything's going to change. No. Some of the stuff could take 10, 20, 30, or 40 or more years to change. Some things never change. I mean, some of these homes were built well before any of us were born, and they're still in the same, general style that they were. A lot of these are guidelines and aspirations for how we'd like to see future development, future conversions happen. We don't want to put anybody out of business. That's not our goal of doing things. It's more, how can we start having an idea and some guidelines to get us to a place that is safe, that's a good character for styles of development that people, obviously from that design preference survey, people want to see development like that. But no, not everybody here wants to pay thousands of dollars out of their own pocket to do it, and that's not what we're asking for. As development happens in the future, you get incremental change, and that's really what we're looking for as this happens over time. So, yes.
Thanks, John. Jack Rogers. First of all, I just want to applaud what you and your team are doing here. I think instead of being negative, I think it's a positive thing. It's not going to happen overnight, but rather than allow this area to continue to deteriorate and become more commercial and look more commercial and tire shops and so forth, I think it's a great idea over the next 30 years, 40 years. I'm not going to be around here to see it all, but I think it's a great idea. I think it's great that you guys are doing it. It's going to be incremental. It's going to happen over a long period of time, and I like the real positive approach this your team has taken.
Oh, I thought you were.
I grew up in Poquonnock Bridge, and I'm back here living now. And I remember, I don't remember if it was the 50s or 60s, the worst thing was when Dairy Queen came in and tore that beautiful Victorian house down. My parents were so upset. How can we prevent a lot of the other little, there are not that many big houses left, but how do you prevent some of the older houses from getting demolished and, saving them?
I don't know if you want to jump in also. I'm happy to sing and dance up here.
Yeah.
So, there's not a lot that we can do to prevent demolition. What we can do is give people guidance, give them incentives to keep historic homes that are there, and that always helps add to the character of the area. It's something we want to see more houses preserved. Also, I think it's important when looking at the renderings and the designs that Jeremy and his team did, we weren't proposing demolishing buildings, knocking things down. We're looking at how could you very nicely put additions on. What are some of the smaller things you can do that can really add to the character of an area like this? So.
And I will say in general, I think that anytime you can provide guidance to the development community about what you're wanting, it's helpful, right? When they come in and they don't know what you're trying to achieve, nobody cares about that. Victorian will knock down and build, our typical model. Whereas if they see all these guidelines that talk about reinforcing the historic, or, they might realize suddenly, like, that's going to be an uphill battle for us to try to do that. Maybe that isn't the appropriate approach here. Or vice versa, the people like the salon owners that say, like, this is exactly the kind of place I want to start a business because this is a great thing going on, and they're trying to make it even better. So I think anytime you can be clear about your intentions, which is really what guidelines are, right? Like we said there's no teeth behind them in the sense of the being the regulations, but they do express a principled intent, and that's always very helpful. It gives developers a sense of where the town's head's at, and I think everybody wins when you can do that, so.
Excuse me. My name is Gail Good, and that brown house that you showed opposite the salon, that's where I live. Now, I have lived in Poquonnock Bridge since 1953, and I'm still thinking, where would all of this go? I mean, there are schools that are no longer be schools. There are stores, and the Ackley package store, that little, the bar, the garage, and then you have the field. And then you have what? I mean, when did it become Poquonnock Bridge Village? And who desired this? You use the word desire often, sir, you. And I just don't know how you can change something like that by putting up some shrubbery and taking away parking. You know, one of the things that annoys me the most is having to walk a half a mile to get where I want to get when I could have parked right in front before they decided to change it. You know, and there's a lot of older folk around here, and I'm one of them. We don't want to be strolling along. And there is a boardwalk that nobody ever uses. I didn't even know it was there. That runs right along Poquonnock River, all the way down to Bluff Point almost. I don't see what your point is with doing all this. This gentleman probably thinks I'm being negative, but I'm not, because the other reality, the real reality, is that the traffic on Route 1 in that particular section of town, let's go back to a couple of weeks ago when that power line fell down. Until 2 o'clock in the morning, there were trailer trucks, there were tandem trucks, and it will happen every single year, and especially in the summertime, whenever there's an accident. That is the route to get back to where they need to go. And nobody slows down going on that road, okay? And I see what they did to downtown Mystic. This is not downtown Mystic. It's Poquonnock Bridge. I don't know where you got the village part from, but it's Poquonnock Bridge.
Yes, sir.
Tom Olson. One of the things I see, and just this, what kind of does a follow on to what this lady just asked about, was has you taken any of this to the state of Connecticut relative to taking a look at a safety funding for rehab of Route 1 from Fort Hill all the way through to where it goes back to 2 lanes? Or to 4 lanes, because this is where it gets constricted. You only have 2 lanes. There's a lot of traffic, a lot of people trying to turn off. Was there a consideration of taking and making this 4-lane Route 1 the whole way, even though there's going to be some growth and stuff in there? Is there any consideration working with the state?
Moving forward, anytime you're looking at a corridor like this, yes, we would work with the state. Often what happens is if you go to the state first, they just have engineering solutions, and often what you find is when you think, oh, okay, we're going to help improve traffic in the area and take it from 2 lanes to 4, people drive faster, and then more people drive through there. And then is that right-of-way actually wide enough, or then buildings getting knocked down? So that's an approach. We haven't started working with the state yet. Any long-term plans for this area for looking at this corridor, certainly we'd be talking with the state on that.
But you are right that it is a challenge. I mean, when it's a state road in your town, the state kind of has ultimate say. But what we're finding is that most states are slowly coming around, right? There needs to be the funding to be able to do it, but they're starting to understand this notion of complete streets. It's not just traffic. It's not just cars. There's all these other uses, especially in places like Poquonnock Bridge. You know, it can't just be about what the vehicles need. It needs to be about what the residents need as well that live there. So we're seeing it come around. They're becoming more appreciative of things like bike lanes. We threw one of those in there for fun. They're getting on board with those kinds of things. So you would have to work with the state. You certainly couldn't go out tomorrow and start tearing up curbs and doing what you want to do in the public in that right of way without talking to the state. So they definitely would need their support. But again, having those conversations with them is a lot easier when you have an idea of what you want rather than sort of just help with nothing to show for what you're really trying to go for. So.
You mentioned bike lanes. When I see a white line next to, to the curb, I say to myself, this is not safe. The line is essentially meaningless, I think. New York has some streets where there's an actual barrier between the bicycle lane and the car lane. have you thought about that at all? Is there some practical solution to that?
Yeah, and again, I would say that the design guidelines aren't necessarily a design. So it's not as if what we're proposing is literally the engineered solution. So like even the bike lane was something that we dreamt up this morning. Like, oh, it'd be great if there was a bike lane there too. There's certainly any number of ways that you could do a bike lane, and you're correct. There are solutions where they try to create some kind of separation, even if it's little cones or whatever the case might be. So again, I think we're not sort of at that level, that this isn't going to that level of detail. It's more about just the general principle of trying to create a pedestrian-friendly environment, so.
Any other comments, questions?
One more thing I'd like to say. Part
Okay.
of what your presentation showed me is
hold
a
on
little
a
bit-
second.
It was a little insulting. You're going to put up a wall barricading Fort Hill homes along Route 1? What is that supposed to tell people? You're so welcome. Yeah, but do you live, you'd like it? I grew up there. Okay. Yeah. Well, the thing is that you have to, I believe that behind all of this is maybe it's supposed to be good and uplifting, but who desired this again?
We are responding to the community development plan that called for a lot of these principles. We're responding to the feedback we got from the visual preference survey that reinforced
And
a
I
lot
was
of these
never, I
principles.
never received any indication that this was happening, and I've lived there for 12 years. I own 2 homes, one in Poquonnock Bridge and one behind the fields. So I've never even knew about last year's
Yeah.
get-together.
Yeah, so
Okay.
I think what we were trying to support was that in that neighborhood, what's important is trying to make where the connections are appropriate and where the streets come out. That's an important place that we need to put a little more emphasis on than there is today. When it's somebody's backyard, it's more appropriate to give them some privacy, more privacy than there is currently. It's just an odd condition because, again, everything you can see, our principle is put your front on the street, and yet you've got this historic condition, which is the
But
antithesis to that. So-
where are these historical places? I mean, Poquonnock Bridge, the projects were built in the 40s. Where I live was built in 1925. Where's the historical, whatever you're trying to replicate?
Yeah. Well, earlier we showed there was a proposed historic district that runs essentially from Town Hall to the Baptist
So there
Church.
is
It's
no
not,
actual historic- you're
I don't think it was ever accepted as a historic district. It was proposed just because of the,
Yeah.
okay.
No, no, we're not making up we're not saying that there's a historic district per state historic district regulations. Can I say what I was going to say? We gave you the floor, ma'am. Some of these homes are classified as historic homes. They're older homes. There is a village in the term of art of what a village is. I mean, it's a walkable area. Historically, that was one of the first areas developed in Groton. So that's why we're looking at this area. Nothing is being decided upon tonight. Nothing is being determined tonight. Tonight was an informational session to get some feedback from people here to talk about when this area develops in the future, continues to develop, and it will, I guarantee you, it will be developed and redeveloped. Things change. Things get knocked down. There used to be a Victorian house that got turned into a Dairy Queen. There used to be something that was there before Johnson's Hardware. Things happen. Okay. Okay. Yeah, it might have been a farm before that. So I'm not trying to get adversarial. So tonight, I really, if people have other comments or questions that haven't spoken yet, yes, so.
Well, but you've elegantly discussed the problem of making it walkable, and you've heard a fair amount of comment about also needing to have access by automobiles. But the one thing that, looking both past, but also into the future, is the role of public transportation. And while this was originally, I believe, an area that where you had some trolley service, how about just as the program develops, you consider where you would have bus stops and what kind of bus service or shuttle service you might have, because that might ease some of the issues of how you do get through the area, also how you interact when you're in the area.
Any other comments, questions? So.
Where do you go from here? I'm just curious. Now, your next step will be what?
So Jeremy had a schedule up before, so we're taking these guidelines and incorporating them into the proposed new zoning regulations. So as moving forward, we'll have public announcements, advertisements about the adoption process for our new zoning regulations, which there'll be public hearings, probably starting sometime in June of this year, talking about the zoning. And as Jeremy said, these guidelines will probably be an appendice to those zoning regulations, not requirements, but again, guidelines. So I saw another hand up in the back. Oh, and the question that I just answered for those that are watching it on TV at some point in the future was, where are things going from here?
Yes, good evening. I was just watching your presentation, and I was sort of, I must say, I was chuckling with this young lady over here when you were showing your improvements at the intersection of 117 and Route 1. This is the busiest intersection in the entire town, I would say, short of possibly Route 12 and I-95. Every lick of traffic that comes into town, whether they're going to Noank or Groton Long Point or down towards Bluff Point or any of those places, they're right at that traffic light at 117 and Route 1. It is the most congested area in town, in my opinion. Okay, and I was just kind of looking at some of your ideas with driveways. Just point of reference, a lot of those rights of way for the state, which 117 is a state highway, US Route 1 is a state highway, they're non-access highway lines. There are very few driveway cuts permitted by the state on that road. And that's up and down Route 1, and it's up and down the southern point, you call it Newtown Road, Route 117. Just something to keep in mind. It is the busiest place, and I see you have these nice little turning lanes and stuff like that. Good luck with that.
Yeah. Well, we certainly didn't, we certainly weren't like eliminating lanes. We weren't trying to dream that suddenly the cars disappear. So all we were suggesting is there are other configurations that had just as many turning lanes and through lanes as there are currently, but maybe there's a way of doing it that just puts a little more emphasis on the pedestrian crossing, because that's what's missing today. So.
I can speak in favor of the turning lanes. I've crossed that intersection going across Route 1, right by that office building, and with a crossing guard next to me holding a sign that says stop, with the crossing light in our favor, a car turns because they're looking left and not seeing that we're on the right-hand side, turning right into us. So I think this turning lane with that island that makes a separate turn, that was, and the crossings, you had two segments for the crossing. That makes it much safer than trying to venture out into a crosswalk where a right-turning car is not looking at the crossing guard, at the lights, and at you.
Yeah, and I would just add too, I think, again, when you get somewhere where the buildings are way back from the street, maybe there aren't even curbs to begin with, there aren't trees, street trees lining the street, there's nothing there that visually makes you feel like you're constrained as a driver, so you go a lot faster than you would if suddenly there were regular street trees or curbs or sidewalks, people actually on the sidewalks, buildings close to the street. All those things are these subconscious cues that tell us when we're getting somewhere we need to slow down. And it is one of the challenges right now, that especially that at that intersection. And part of the reason we looked at those buildings, if you brought them to the street, drivers would suddenly know, like, oh, I need to slow down. Like, I'm entering a different kind of place here than what the rest of 117 might have been like. So all those things add up.
Thank you, Mr. Reiner. I wanted to just say, I'm Patrice Granatowski, I'm the town mayor. I wanted to say thank you to all of you for coming out, and for town staff for being here, and for you gentlemen for coming out, and for Mr. Greeley for filming for the people at home this evening. I know we have one very interested person who's going to be watching this online tomorrow, Dr. Burrows, is very curious to see what the plans are for Poquonnock Village. Groton has kind of grown up. If you look at the sign, the new logo that they have, we're a series of little tiny neighborhoods. And the idea is to treasure and value what's unique about those little tiny neighborhoods. There is a lot of character in Poquonnock Bridge. There are some lovely old houses. There are some wonderful houses from the 20s, some wonderful houses from the 40s, and there will be changes, I'm sure. There have been offers for things that I don't really want to see happening in Poquonnock Bridge. And I think this is a lovely alternative that's being proposed. So I think it's a really good idea that we have this out there as an alternative template. Instead of another little strip mall with another gas station, mini mart, maybe we could do something different. If someone does want to come in and develop, like Mr. Rogers, for example, who put in some new housing off of Route 1 there, there are alternative ideas that will treasure and respect the character of the neighborhood, the old farms, the old houses that are there. So thank you very much for doing this, and thank you for presenting the ideas to the community.
Any other comments or questions from anybody? Yeah. There you go.
It just seems like in this area, this isn't the only problem you're thinking about. Even Groton, Hamburger Hill, that all happened in what, the 50s, the 60s here? And it's too bad we have all that there too that we have to deal with. It'd be nice if we could figure out a problem with that also.
Yes, a solution, yes. Something I always like to say is, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. And this is one area that we're looking at as part of the larger rezoning project that Jeff is working on, as well as Jeremy. We're looking at design guidelines for the downtown area also. This project was specifically focused and called out in our long-range plan, that plan of conservation and development, to do a specific deep dive into Poquonnock Bridge. And that's why we did these design guidelines for that area that we're proposing. We are looking at some alternatives for Hamburger Hill, as well as other areas in town, so that as things change and develop over time, there will be alternatives to the suburban development patterns of the 1950s and 60s and 70s. If there are no other questions or comments, going once, twice.
Are your long-term plans for the town, as far as what you were just saying?
So the zoning, the last time that we did a comprehensive rewrite of our zoning was about 30 years ago. So these things change over time, and we're not always caught up. And those are things that we have to do. And these plans, our long-range plan, our plan of conservation and development, we generally will redo that plan every 10 years, but it looks at a 20-plus year planning horizon of what do we expect to happen over the next 20 years. We as a town are very fortunate to know that over the next 20 to 30 years, what Electric Boat's plans are for their employee base and expansion. That is going to help us in our longer range planning for how do we plan for that as opposed to react to that. And we know that EB is growing over time, their workforce is changing, they're going to have a lot of retirees over the next 5 to 10 years. So we're going to see a huge shift in their workforce and what the new workforce is looking for as far as housing, as far as retail and other services. So as time goes on, we are going to see change, and we can either accept that change and try to plan with it and get ahead of it, or we can just react to it and get development that maybe we're not all that thrilled with. So that really is the initiative behind not only this project, our zoning project, and a lot of the other things that we've been working on over the past 5 years. Yep. So, all right. Well, I want to thank everyone very much for coming out tonight. If you're interested in this topic, please check out the webpage. There'll be meeting agendas. There'll be notices of public meetings that we're having on this, as well as over the course of the next month, the draft zoning regulations, the whole document will be posted up on there. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us at the Planning Department. So thank you very much for coming tonight.